December 30, 1862, Widow's Hollow, a low seam of land north of Murfreesboro where cedar stands grip the limestone and fog lays in like wool before dawn. Frost bit the fence rails and made every breath look like a secret told twice. A lone soldier in Union blue, boots split at the toes and buttons, dulled with road mud, came off the Nashville Pike by instinct more than map, drawn by the thin orange of a lamp behind a pane. Hunger wears a man's feet like a bridle. The house at the bend sat modest. Dogtrot gap black with night, 2 rooms either side, a smokehouse squatting close as if eavesdropping, a well-handled tipped with ice. Nothing about it bragged except the smell of meat that had met salt and fire. He knocked with a knuckle gone numb. Hope learns the simplest rhythm first. The door opened to Ruth Lowry's small figure and steady eyes, a wool shawl drawn tight, hair bound neat even at this hour, lamp held high enough to bless and measure a stranger in one sweep. Her welcome slid off the cold like oil. "Come in, soldier," she said, the Tennessee in her voice gentle as a creek. "We can warm you and set you right." Words can be quilts when a man is shaking. Ezekiel Lowry loomed behind her, wide-shouldered and even wider through the chest, lean face shaved clean, sleeves rolled up, an apron brushed with flour and something that grease, plumed when the light touched it. Big men wear calm like a coat when they want to. The soldier crossed the threshold and counted the ordinary: a table, rubbed to a soft shine, a straight-backed chair, a Bible near the hearth, a coffee pot breathing faintly, a string of dried apples like punctuation along a beam. Ordinary can be a stage. "You're not the first to come through," Ezekiel said, setting down a bowl as if it deserved ceremony. "We bury our share too, when the Lord asks it." Hospitality advertises mercy even while it measures it. From the testimony of Sjeet L. Corbett, 3rd Kentucky Volunteer Cavalry, 1866, "I was offered broth and said yes. I was told to sit and took a chair. I was told I looked poorly and felt it. I was told I could rest and believed it." Trust is a door with 2 hinges. Outside, the smokehouse wept long dark tears from under its door, fat condensed by the cold into beads that plinked to the packed earth. A drip can keep time better than a clock. Ruth brought out a tin cup, with laudanum's breath riding the steam, something sweet spiked with the bitter that claims it is medicine. Relief can be an ambush when the walls are kind. "Easy now," she whispered, palm to the rim as he drank, the lantern behind her gilding the edge of her fingers and turning her wedding band into a small sun. Light lies most beautifully over metal. He tasted iron under the salt and told himself it was the spoon. A lie, when kindly, passes muster in a starving mouth. Down the dog trot a door stood cracked to the smokehouse, a line of hooks barely visible beyond, curved like questions, heavy with shadow, grease sheen catching the wick's reach, and then letting it go. Tools look like letters when a room is illiterate. Ezekiel set bread beside the bowl without looking at the man, as if to give him privacy with his hunger. Courtesy is sometimes the neatest blade. "I reckon you're headed for Stone's River," he said, naming the river the way locals do, like a neighbor rather than a map. The coming battle had thickened the roads for a week. "Yes," the soldier started, and the word dragged a cough behind it, and he turned his head to keep it from the table. He had manners even here. War keeps an odd grip on etiquette. Ruth's hand found his shoulder with the kind of firmness that says there is no need to worry and every reason. Pressure can sing a lullaby to a mind already sinking. From the deposition of Peavey, A.D., 21st Ohio Infantry, taken 1867. "I recall a kindness that went beyond reason for strangers. I recall the smell of pig, though they said the pig had gone to bone weeks ago. I recall a cleaver set and shining clean. Memory edits and still leaves the stain. The hollow around the house packed sound into pockets and released them when it chose. A whip pour, Will lifted its name once and then swallowed it again as if shy. Even birds know when to keep count wrong." The soldier's head dipped and came back up with the stubbornness of a man who has outrun too many things to let sleep win his name tonight. Exhaustion knows how to braid shame with relief. "You can lay your bones here till morning," Ezekiel offered, nodding at a pallet near the hearth, his eyes not unkind, the aproned bulk of him the kind of presence that makes a room feel stewarded. Some predators have a shepherd's gait. Ruth's mouth folded into what might have been called a shy smile in a different life, and she fetched a quilt that smelled faintly of smoke and clean linen and something metallic that might have been a coin rubbed too long. Scent is an archivist when words are corruptible. From a letter never posted, written in pencil on a torn page and found in the lining of a knapsack near Laverne, undated. A house with a woman like any mother, and a man who could lift a hog with one hand. They said they bury men, and I said I would not need that. They said lots say that. Denial rounds its edges in the mouth and sets there like a small stone. Beyond the partition. Thin paper of a different sort hung on a string to dry. Grayback sketched in a careful hand. Jefferson Davis's profile a little wrong, if you look too long. The ink's black too eager in the loop of a serial number repeated twice down the line. Money when it is new and counterfeit. Smells like ambition and lampblack. A draft hissed under the threshold and lifted the edges of the notes, so they trembled like insect wings. Walls can be another kind of wallet. Ruth saw his glance slide that way and glided into the gap, hip against the jamb, lamp angled to encourage a different curiosity. Deflection is a talent handed down with recipes. You from Indiana? She asked, adding familiarity as if it were a pinch of salt, her gaze taking in the cut of the coat, the nickeled giant, letter I that still had its shine under grime. Small talk is a tool sharper than a knife when it's used by a steady hand. He nodded and swallowed, and set the cup down slow enough to pretend he was choosing careful instead of forced. Choices made under a roof are not always choices. From Provost Marshall's Field Notes, Middle Tennessee District 1865, locals report a widow's hollow, where stragglers pass, some to return thinner, some not at all. Names supplied: Ezekiel Lowry, Ruth Lowry. Alleged services: burial, victuals. Alleged outcomes undefined. Official ink goes pale when it meets a thing that won't be named. In the smokehouse, a chain rasped against wood with the careless hiss that comes when a link turns under its own weight. Metal has its own impatience with secrets. Ezekiel's hand, scar along the thumb like a pale worm, old and white, lifted the ladle again, and the soldier watched the way the knuckles flexed, the ease with which the big man moved around hot and heavy, thought briefly of pack mules back home, and then hated himself for comparing. The mind finds metaphors when it needs permission. Shot men come through here all the time now, Ezekiel said in that easy tone, and some die for lack of a hand to hold. We like to be that hand. Mercy's mask fits many faces and one job. The soldier's eyes closed in a blink that asked for nothing and acknowledged everything, and the room's warmth climbed his boots and up into his calves like a tide. Heat is a conspiracy when a man has been cold too long. From the sworn statement of Here Mr. Civilian Teamster, filed 1866, I slept one night at the Lowrys and woke with my pocket turned out and a beef taste in my mouth I can't account for. I did not see beef. I did not inquire. I kept my skin. Cowardice is another word for survival when told aloud by men who lived. A wagon wheel clacked somewhere up the hollow, and Ruth was at the door before anyone else could turn, peering into a fog that had thinned to where shapes arranged themselves suggestively and stayed that way. Visitors make shadows show their discipline. She shut the door softly and slid the bolt into its sleeve without looking at her guest. Locks speak more honestly than hosts. Best settle, she murmured, as much to the house as to the man, and set the lamp low, and in the quick eclipse between flame one height and flame the other, the soldier's heart thumped once against his ribs in the way it does when a sleeper begins. Night is a collaborator when it has been paid. The quilt came up to his chin and made him smaller than he liked to be and dearer than he had been in months, and he let go of the thought that he should not, and then of the idea that he could choose to hold it, and then of the room itself as it sank to a hum. Surrender hides in comfort in the seconds, before it calls itself by any other name. Outside, drip answered drip from the smokehouse eaves, a duet that lasted all winter in places like this, where salt had kissed flesh and made it able to live long past the day. Preservation is an art with altars. From a federal inventory, 1865, penciled in a margin, Under smokehouse bones, mixed, lime, hook's chain, cleaver with notch, bucket stained, earth packed, no markers. Lists can be a verdict when voices have burned. Best sleep, Ezekiel said to the room, though the soldier's eyes were already closed, and Ruth put her hand flat on the table near the ladle like she was praying, though no words came from her mouth. Quiet can be worship or warning. The wind slipped through the dog trot with a sound like a coat being shrugged off a nail, and somewhere in the hollow a fox barked and startled itself into silence again. Even the wild forget themselves at a right noise. From a neighbor's recollection, taken after the fire, Moo said later we never knew. We did know something was not right in the way the smoke hung there, and the way the Lowrys' dogs did not bark. We owed ourselves that lie. Communities choose blindfolds that fit like Sunday hats. By first light, frost wrote its flower, work on the windows inside, and Ruth wiped a circle clear with the heel of her hand, and looked out as if expecting a line of men already, as if the house had a schedule. Anticipation is a form of appetite that does not need a plate. The soldier did not wake when she moved the lamp. Sleep, having chosen him, kept him as if paid in advance. From Sjeet L. Corbett's testimony, I made it out of there. Others did not. I do not know why I was chosen to tell this. I do know the block in the smokehouse had 2 grooves cut into it, deep as fingers and smooth as boat wood. Detail is the last mercy of the witness. The Lowrys' place at the bend wore its ordinariness like a uniform well fitted, each seam in the right place, each button sober, the dog trot swept, the Bible placed so it would be seen without being asked to do any work. Respectability has its own drill. The fog lifted in a sheet, and the hollow showed itself lined with cedar and limestone, and the faint footpaths of men who had come at odd hours, and not all returned by any hour. Paths tell on a place when they stop too soon. Later men would stand with shovels where the smokehouse had squatted, and say words that tasted of bile and iron and rotten promises. Later, forge plates pried from a stud would clatter into a canvas bag. Later, a name would be burned with a house. Judgment learned to sweat. But on this morning, when the war's mouth had opened wide nearby, and the town's sleep had splintered into watch and worry, the Lowrys ladled kindness into bowls and arranged their tools for later. Preparation is a kindness too, when the plan is butcher's work. He slept, and the house breathed, and the hollow listened the way hollows do when they have already chosen their answer. Some places eat sound to keep the peace, and by the time the sun cleared the cedar tops and found the smokehouse's roof and threw a hard light along the line of hooks inside, the story had already taken its shape without asking permission. In Widow's Hollow, those who stayed did not leave. Middle Tennessee in the winter of 1862 wore 2 uniforms at once. Union blue flowing down the Nashville Pike with the Army of the Cumberland, and Confederate gray slipping through cedar breaks with the Army of Tennessee, their movements turning farms into maps and kitchens into way stations. War made every front door a checkpoint. Murfreesboro sat at the seam, a town of brick storefronts and church spires now rinned with wagon ruts, picket posts, and improvised hospitals where hymnals had given way to lint and laudanum. Geography turned to trige. Rosecrans pushed south with 50,000 men and 3 days' bread. Bragg angled north with 40,000 and a belly full of December. The collision had a date before it had a name. They would call it Stone's River, 2nd Murfreesboro to some. Fought December 31, 1862 to January 2, 1863. 3 days of cedar thickets and limestone outcrops that swallowed shots and returned smoke. Local names outlived military ones. Between those lines lay Widow's Hollow, a fold of land just enough off the pike to feel private, and just enough on the way to attract the straggler, the forager, the wounded who believed a lamp meant sanctuary. Trust is a currency that spends fast in a war. Ezekiel and Ruth Lowry lived there, or said they did. A couple of modest acres, a dog trot house, a smokehouse close enough to touch with a broom handle, a well with a bucket worn to a groove by rope. Ordinary is a disguise that seldom fails. Neighbors called Ezekiel a strong back and a sure hand with a hog, Ruth a steady presence with a pot. They were known to read Bible at night and to bargain fair for eggs when eggs were scarce. Respectability is a uniform of its own. The Lowrys offered what soldiers wanted most: food, heat, and the promise of sleep without a sergeant to call it back, and they offered it to either side with equal courtesy and price. Neutrality tastes like mercy when your feet hurt. From a letter of P.V.T. J.T. Loomis, 15th Indiana, 28 December 1862. The people at the bent of the hollow took us in with civility and coffee. I did not look hard at the meat for fear it would look hard back. Hunger chooses its blindfold. Both armies sent patrols down every needful lane. Union provosts searching for liquor and deserters, Confederate cavalry under Wheeler, and forest poaching wagon teams and information, and both learned to fear how quickly the land absorbed men who stepped off the main road. Stragglers vanished the way smoke does in Cedar. The Lowrys advertised a second service the valley understood: burial for those who died of wounds too small to impress a surgeon and too persistent to spare a household. Crosses made from fence pickets, names scratched on plank with a nail. Families needed the fiction of closure. From the recollection of Martha Elam, neighbor, recorded 1866. They said they would lay him down if it came to that, and put him in good ground. They said it soft, and I was grateful till later. Softness hides teeth when the room is warm. The economy around them had split in two along with the flag. Greenbacks newly issued with federal promises inked across their faces. Graybacks whose value wandered like dust on a porch. And wherever value wobbles, forgery moves in like a neighbor with a joke and a hammer. Paper tempts more than men admit. Confederate currency bore seals and signatures that grew sloppier as the war ate time. Plates passed from city to city. Engravers worked by lamplight. Paper quality sank with each blockade month. Imperfection invites imitation. In a house like the Lowrys, a crude press could be cobbled from maple and iron strap, an etching on zinc or soft copper coaxed into something that might pass in a dim room, lampblack and linseed pressed into rag paper, with a serial number copied from last week's handshake. Counterfeiting requires only nerve and a steady wrist. From a notation in a federal investigator's memorandum, Department of the Cumberland, 1865, plate seized. Confederate 5 and Antum, imperfections noted in bust, flourish in serial repeats at inconsistent intervals. Ink home mixed, lampblack oil, crime leaves its own chemistry behind. What the Lowrys added to the ledger the army kept would not be noticed until later. Bodies that stopped at their table and did not pass their gate again. Bones found in ground that had been salted and sifted under a smokehouse floor. The press marks of forged paper taken from a wall cavity, like a story someone tried to hide behind plaster. Evidence sleeps shallow when it has been hurried. During the battle, the county filled with sound. Cannon calling and answering over Cedar. Musketry finding and losing rhythm. The irregular rumor of men lost and found and lost again. And in such weather men stepped off into hollows and disappeared. Noise can cover more than retreat. After the battle, Rosecrans held Murfreesboro. Bragg slipped away through rain and regret, and the Army of the Cumberland wintered in a churn of picket duty, foraging, and hospital rot. War leaves chores after it leaves front pages. Into that winter churn walked the story of Widow's Hollow, first as caution in a tent at the edge of a hospital yard, then as certainty in the provost's ledger, then as a task-turned assignment, when a colonel did not like the way bones rolled out of a shovel, when a man cleared a space for his fire. Small discoveries pulled generals away from maps. From Provost Marshal's report, Murfreesboro Sub, District, April 1863, information received that Lowry Homestead, known locally as Widow's Hollow Place, has admitted soldiers and civilians who have not thereafter been accounted for. Ordered discreet examination. Official prose wears gloves. Technology was simple and sufficient for quiet work. Laudanum in a bottle with a merchant's label. A cleaver polished to a sheen against hog bone. A block with grooves cut by years of slaughter. Lime to lay over what the earth did not wish to keep. Implements need no ideology to do harm. The smokehouse, so close to the dog trot, concentrated scent and habit. Hams hung to harden, hooks glistened, and the floor learned to drink. Architecture becomes accomplice when the task is repeated. In February and March of '63, soldiers scavenged for corn and bacon and turned up graves as often as turnips. marking them with bayonets so teams could return with shovels and something like courage. Forensics in that year was a farmer's art with a soldier's patience. Among the bones under the Lowrys, a smokehouse, men would later recognize more human joints than hog, femur heads where ham should hang, teeth that did not belong to swine, a button with an eagle smudged by mold. Details convict more calmly than oaths. From SGT, Elkrabet's deposition, 1866. I saw a man's radius set in dirt like a handle. I saw lime thrown over the patch not for smell but for denial. I saw hooks I would not touch and a chain that spoke a clink when no hand pulled it. Memory keeps the sound even when the shape fades. The forged notes stuffed in the wall, graybacks with bold serials, tied the house to a wider market, because counterfeit travels farther than bodies. Greed has a better supply line than mercy. By 65, when federal authority had grown into its post-war limbs, the Department of the Cumberland's provosts could write, visit, seize, and seal, and the bureau men who would later call themselves guardians of freedmen also knew how to read a homestead for signs of pressure and profit. The machinery of government arrives late and loud, yet the Lowrys never saw the inside of a formal courtroom. Paper often fails where fire succeeds. Locals claimed God's justice and lit the house themselves, and the record, such as it is, says the roof fell in like a shrug and the smokehouse followed, and within the timbers men found not confession but the end of the evidence. Crowds are impatient archivists. From a notice in a Nashville paper, August 1865, buried among sale ads, Delling House, outbuilding burned in Rutherford County, suspected illicit activity, no charges preferred. Euphemism pads the floor under gallows talk. By the 1870 census, the name Lowry did not occupy a line on the page where it once had, and neighbors, when asked, said they'd moved or died or never lived there with the confidence of people who want to be left alone by their own memories. Erasure is a civic collaboration. The two armies had their own butcher's books from Stones River. 24,000 casualties across 3 days. Bodies stacked in cedar thickets and along the river's bend. Surgeons sawing by the hour and stopping when the light did. And in that landscape the nickname, Butchers of Widow's Hollow, sounded less like exaggeration than an echo. The war had taught the vocabulary. The Hollow applied it at home. Technology produced faith and fear in equal measure in those months. Railroads that brought surgeons faster than a horse could gallop. Telegraphs that carried orders and gossip on the same line. Greenbacks that spent in one place and not in another. Laudanum that could heal or hush. And in such weather, a simple house with a press and a smokehouse could become a factory for harm. Mechanism does not check motive. From an army chaplain's note, January 1863. The poor come to doorways and find heaven or its counterfeit. We cannot tell which from the road. Piesters learn to travel with doubt. Why this matters, beyond the names and the fence line, is that war unthreads the rope of law and leaves the ends in the hands of people who will braid whatever they need to live, or to eat, or to get rich. Chaos offers its own contracts. The Lowrys exploited the blind spot where charity looks like trade and trade looks like salvation. They set a table that impressed both armies and built a smokehouse that concealed both crimes. Hospitality made into a weapon is hard to see until it bites. When federal troops dug under the smokehouse after the place was empty of people, they found more than bones. They found the diagram of a practice, hooks set at measured intervals, lime mounded in a corner, a barrel stained where it should not be, a press impression left in soft wood, where a plate had been hammered too hard and too often. Patterns reveal themselves when the operator is gone. From the provost sealed appendix, later stamped, medical confidentiality, for reasons no one would explain out loud, remains in varied stages of decomposition, some long buried, some recent, 'cause undetermined, liquids on premises unfit for medicinal use, forgeries of Confederate notes present in wall cavity, no survivors to swear. Seals hide shame as often as secrets. Both sides, Union soldiers, Confederate stragglers, civilians trying to pass, walked into that room believing the same story, that war had spared one household, so that it could spare them for a night. Stories keep men alive until they don't. Later, When locals lit the house with their own hands and called it justice, they also burned the ledger the hollow needed to speak plainly. Dates, names, purchases, doses. Fire absolves and erases without discrimination. The cedar posts in the hollow still stand on limestone, and the pike is still a road to somewhere and back. And if you ask about the Lowrys in a voice too interested, someone might say they were kind until the end, and someone else might say the end arrived, because kindness had gone missing at the kitchen table. Memory votes and never reaches a quorum. What is left are the pieces that fit together without asking permission. A battle that turned the county inside out, a house that offered what soldiers crave, forged notes that promised more than they could deliver, bones that do not lie under a smokehouse floor unless placed there by a human hand. Facts don't burn as easily as wood, and so the stage stands set armies within earshot, a farmstead in the seam of movement, a couple who learned to speak the language of comfort in a year when comfort was rare, and a hollow that would teach later diggers how to read soil for stories it would rather not tell. Silence in cedar country carries weight like wet linen on a line. The Lowry homestead worked like a device built of cedar and limestone, a dog-trot house wired by habit to a smokehouse, and well, every part serving a sequence like gears set to different teeth. It ran on need. The dog-trot, a breezeway cleaving 2 rooms under a single roof, pulled cool drafts in summer and, in winter, channeled smoke and scent like a flue drawn horizontal. Air became camouflage. On the east side, the kitchen chamber held a long table rubbed to buttered wood, a shelf of crocks and a bottle or two labeled paregoric and laudanum, tinctures whose Latin softened their purpose. Medicine doubled as method. Laudanum in those years was opium dissolved in alcohol. Tinctura opi, heavy with morphine and codeine, a legal sovereign on every shelf for cough, sleeplessness, pain. Overdose sounded like rest. From C.G.L. Corbett's deposition, 1866, they served a cup that let the eyes float inside the head. I do not like to remember liking it. Comfort can be a hook. Outside the kitchen, the smokehouse squatted on limestone with a door barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, its rafters studded with iron hooks at careful intervals. Spacing measured what language refused. Hooks 6 inches apart along the near beam, then a gap for the block, then a second run at 8 inches, each hammered to a depth that would bear a hog quarter or its equivalent in silence. Iron practiced certainty. Underfoot, the floor was tamped clay gone to brick with use, and beneath that clay, a pit lined with white, gray lime waited to drink and keep secrets at once. Chemistry wore an apron. Lime, quick when dry, slaked when damp, kept smell down and flies off, and told itself it was making the world cleaner. It did not cause forgetting, but it encouraged it. The butcher's block stood end grain up, a bowl-cut waist, high and worked until 2 channels formed from repeated draws of a blade. Grooves so smooth they felt like boatwood under the hand. Habit leaves topography. A cleaver hung beside it on a nail, the blade's edge bright as scripture, the back notched from a year that had required more bone than a kitchen should meet. Steel remembers the number of blows even when memory fails to. From a federal inventory, 1865, lever E8-inch saw bone, gambrel iron I2, pulleys Isa wooden, chain I1 length present, floor stained, lime heap at corner. Hardware writes its own confession. Their water system was simple and complicit. The well outside fitted with a sweep and a bucket that had worn a groove deep in the lip from years of rope. A scalding barrel near enough to the smokehouse that a 2-man carry could bring boiling water from hearth to hook in less than a minute. Heat becomes an accomplice at arm's length. At 145 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, water will free hair from hog skin with a bell scraper if you hurry. At about the same temperature, a man's senseless skin offers no complaint to steel. Technique crosses species when conscience is quiet. Ezekiel Lowry was a man built for leverage, and he ran the heavy end of the machine, the lift, the hang, the cut, the carry. His apron the color of flour in the dog trot, and the color of work in the smokehouse. He wore strength like a tool. Ruth Lowry managed the fine tolerances, the pour, the pinch, the timing between kindness and quiet. The aftercare of Lens boiled and hung where the air could not gossip. She wore precision like a shoal. From the testimony of Pvt. A.D. 21st Ohio Infantry, 1867. She took my pulse with her hand on my wrist and took the cup away when I did not know it had left my mouth. I slept too quickly. I do not think I was meant to finish the bread. Timing is doctrine in a house like that. Their doctrine had chapters, practiced as faithfully as any drill. Approach with warmth, assess insignia and fatigue, offer broth and a medicine. For cough, see the eyes soften, suggest a pallet near the hearth, slide a bolt across a door by habit, pass weight between two rooms without noise, and claim burial with scripture. Ritual can be predatory. The dog trot carried sound like a hallway in a barracks, and the Lowrys tuned it. Rugs laid where boards squeaked, hinges greased with tallow, a latch reshaped to close with pressure, not snap. Silence was engineered. Under the kitchen window, a small bench held tools that were not culinary. A bell scraper, a rope with a loop rubbed smooth, a length of leather that might be called a strap if anyone were feeling charitable. Names hide tasks when a town needs to sleep. Beyond meat and men, there was paper. A second machine set up in the far room at night, when the lamp could be trimmed down to a low, obedient flame and the dog trot's draft could dry a sheet without warping it. Money prints quietly. Confederate notes of 62 and 63 were a forger's invitation. Lithographed stones wore thin, signatures varied wildly. Paper quality dipped with each blockade month, and serial numbers were hand-added in red or black with a flourish that looked like a secret handshake. Imperfection is a blueprint. A crude press lived under a canvas at the Lowrys. 2 uprights of maple strapped with iron, a screw whose handle wore the polished sweat of hands, a platen cut from dense wood, its face ink, slick and pitted. Gravity and thread did the work artisans once did with apprenticeship. From a department of the Cumberland Memorandum, 1865, plates seized inch, crude incisions, bust of Davis slightly misproportioned, serials repeated, ink composition lampblack oil. Even a counterfeit has fingerprints. Lampblack came easy. Soot scraped from the chimney into a crock, cut with a little linseed or tallow, ground until it flowed under a brayer. Paper came harder. Rag stock scavenged. Sometimes banker's letterhead lifted and shaved, sometimes coarse and eager to drink too much. Supplies read the war's mouth as closely as soldiers did. The red that marked cereals could be a pinch of vermilion if a man were well, connected or madder if he were clever. Sometimes just thickened ink warmed over a lamp to coax a richer shade. Color carries confidence when it dries. Ruth's hand, small and neat, could copy a clerk's loop with unnerving fidelity, and she practiced on newspapers until the curves lived in her knuckles. Calligraphy is a weapon when the bank is a mule team and a dark store. Distribution was improvisation and nerve. Pass a note to a cavalryman at dusk in exchange for pork. Slip a 10 across a counter in a county where greenbacks felt like a rumor. Send a boy to trade a 5 for a sack of corn at a crossroads where the store hung its lamp low. Commerce tolerates a little fiction when food is involved. From a letter never sent, found charred near the hearth. We prefer the 10s. The 5s buy too little and the 20s ask too many questions. Denomination dictates danger. The land outside enforced its logic on their machine. Cedar breaks pinched sightlines to 40 yards. Limestone shelf made digging hard where you wanted it, and easy where you did not. Sinkholes drank rain and rumor both without complaint. Terrain colludes with design. Pickets posted on the pike rotated with the unsteady rhythm of winter fatigue. And the Lowrys learned their schedule by ear. The time between the clink of canteens and the creak of leather, the slack of watches when a sergeant set men to warm their hands and forget to count. Doctrine slots into petrol patterns like a blade into a worn sheath. From Provost Marshall's Field Notes, March 1863. House at Widow's Hollow keeps its light low at hours between posts. Smokehouse door faces away from pike. Dog does not bark. Suspicious. Animals are honest record keepers. The smokehouse's smoke was its own mask. The hickory fumes claiming the air, when blood might have offered a sharper signature. Scent is counsel when law has not yet arrived. Ezekiel had a bone saw shorter than a surgeon's, but capable of the same evil music. Its teeth set for push and pull through pig joint or, if the hour demanded, something else's. Tools do not pray before use. their burial practice borrowed from hog work, repetition, economy, a refusal to waste motion, and abused the churchyard's grammar, no marker, lime cover, a board tamped in that never saw a prayer. Syntax matters when it comes to the dead. Under the smokehouse, the pit was a geometry of denial. 2 feet down to clay, another foot scooped to soften the line, lime sprinkled in a thin snow that stung the eyes, a layer of newspaper, then weight lowered, then more lime, then the world smoothed with the back of a shovel. Layers order conscience. From SGT, Elkobet's deposition, I put my hand on the dirt later and felt it soft where it should have been hard. A man knows ground that has been asked to forget recently. Touch knows lies. Doctrine also included grace notes to pass inspection. Always a Bible on the table with a page dog, eared to Psalms. Always a pot on the back of the stove. Always a string of apples or peppers to stage the season honestly. Always a clean apron hung near the door to be thrown on for the inspector's eye. Theater buys time. When soldiers came in formation, 3 or 4, muskets stacked in a leaning T outside, the Lowrys adjusted, feeding more and giving less, shepherding them back to the road with talk of picket shifts, and the sergeant known to punish lingerers. Tactics bend to numbers. When a single man staggered in with a story cut by cough, the machine smiled and weird, a hand to the elbow, a chair turned to catch him, a cup offered and watched, a lock drawn slow. Predation thrives on solitude. From a neighbor's recollection, Hay could lift a hog by the hock with one hand, and Ruth could sell a candle to a woman who had just come from church with a new one. They made a living in a year when living was hard, and they made more than a living. Prosperity can be an indictment. Countermeasures grew after rumors sharpened. Pickets sent in pairs, passes demanded and countersigned. A provost's patrol taught to knock with the butt of a musket, and to stand where they could see both doors and the smokehouse hinge at once. Procedure learns fast when it bleeds. The Lowrys adjusted, their lamp trimmed lower, their door cracked just enough to hold a conversation without yielding angle, their kettle always up at a roll so any scent that wandered could plead the case for supper. Adaptation saves machines from seizure. The kitchen's shelf taught another lesson about their doctrine. Every bottle labeled, every cloth folded, every spoon nested, everything arranged to suggest that nothing was hidden, while the one thing that mattered hid where no label would ever be placed. Order distracts. From a Treasury agent's note, 1865. Though the Federal Secret Service will be constituted for counterfeiting this year, these rural operations pre-date and outpace formal oversight. Notes from the Lowry cash display repeated serials and clumsy signatures. Passable in low light. Law learns late. The clinic corner held a chair with arms worn smooth at the ends, a position useful for women in childbirth, men in fever, and anyone whose pulse you wish to count until it slowed. Furniture can be a trap in polite wood. A pallet near the hearth always stayed inviting. Quilt folded once, pillow plumped. The offer sincere in its shape if not in its purpose. Invitation draws breath to a place you can find later. When the Army of the Cumberland settled in winter quarters after Stones River, passes sprouted like buds and forage parties moved in loose rectangles across the farms. Their lead element, a sergeant and a joke in a wagon. Movement grew predictable. The Lowrys built their schedule around that predictability. Lavaged the floor at dawn, smoke heavy through the cold midday, cool and sweep into the blue hours when footsteps carry less and voices think they do not carry at all. Time is a tool as sharp as a blade. From Provost Report, sealed, for medical confidentiality, excerpti, liquids present laudanum, paregoric camphor, uses declared medicinal quantities exceed household need, conclude probable misuse. Euphemism tempered accusation. When federal men finally put shovels to the earth under the smokehouse, they broke the mechanism and found within it the diagram that had made it hum. Hooks, lime, cleaver, chain, a pattern someone had traced over and over, until even the dog did not worry at blood. Patterns expose intent. Their currency press did not survive the flames intact, but its imprint on soft wood did. The faint echo of a zinc plate hammered too hard against a maple face. Jefferson Davis's jawline, just crooked enough to name. Ghosts can live inside grain. From the ash, they pulled plates with numbers that had been repeated, a sin in printing as much as in prayer, and in a wall cavity they found wads of gray paper with a smell like oil in winter. Forgery has an odor. The machine, the house, the practice, the doctrine, had done its work for as long as patrols were thin and hunger thick, and no part of it thought of itself as anything but necessary until men with shovels put names to parts. Necessity writes its own commandments. In the end, Widow's Hollow's device did not fail for lack of engineering, but because a soldier's memory and a provost's hunch, and a shovel's blade met over limestone and decided to keep digging. Persistence defeats design, and when the wind shifted through the dogtrot one last time and carried a draft into the smokehouse door, as if to test its seal, the only answers it found were lime dust, iron hooks, and the smell of hickory that was supposed to excuse everything. The air remembered what the ledger would not. March 9, 1863, dusk settling blue in the cedar breaks north of Murfreesboro, the cold returning with the confidence of a habit, and the Nashville pike ticking under wagon rims like a metronome for burden. Widow's Hollow took light slowly and gave it back slower. A four-man provost detail stepped off the road at the bend, where smoke laid a gray ribbon low, boots sounding dull on limestone dust, and then hollow on plank where a little footbridge crossed a trickle. Discipline walked on tired legs. SGTL. Corbett carried the paper that made doors open, by order of the Provost Marshal, Department of the Cumberland, and he had folded it twice so it would sit in the breast pocket he touched when a conversation needed gravity. Authority fits a coat if worn often enough. Behind him came P.V. Amos Fenwick, a boy from Hamilton counting heartbeats by habit, and two others whose names the ledger would spell correctly later, and whose faces the Hollow would not forget. Patrol is a plural noun. The Lowry house sat like it always had, dogtrot cut dark between rooms, smokehouse shouldered close as kin, a yard swept until the dirt had learned flatness. Respectability staged the evening. Ruth opened the door at the second knock, lamp at shoulder height, eyes the quiet kind that go all the way in without asking permission. Welcome is a practiced craft. Evening, ma'am, Corbett said, voice steady in a way that wanted to borrow her calm. By order, we'll step inside and look to your outbuildings. Politeness kept its hat on because it had been taught manners. Ezekiel filled the doorway behind her like a beam. Apron on, sleeves up, the picture of a man interrupted at honest work and determined to be patient about it. Mass argues for innocence until evidence weighs more. Soldiers come through all the time, he said, and it sounded like a favor he'd done the county. We feed and bury when the Lord asks it. Repetition had made this line smooth as a river stone. From Provost G. L. Corbett's deposition, filed June 1866. I noted laudanum on the shelf, and a cleaver set too clean for supper. I asked to see the smokehouse, and he said no cause to rummage. I read the paper and said the cause wrote in my pocket. Paper can be a key and a cudgel. Ruth set a tin cup of broth on the table near Corbett's elbow. Before he could say no, the steam carrying a sweet that was not onion, and a bitter that memory would name too late. Hospitality knows how to smell right. Corbett lifted the cup, touched it to his lip, and set it down upside down on the table, so that what wet there was could run under wood instead of into a man. Signals keep men together when words would make trouble. PVT. Fenwick watched the cup land and felt his stomach do a small mule kick that did not show on his face. Good training stays quiet even when it wants to talk. Smokehouse, Corbett said, moving his weight toward the dogtrot, as if the air there owed him something, and he tapped the folded order with 2 fingers. Ritual greases friction. Ezekiel stood where a door becomes a question, and then stepped aside when a uniform and a pistol made the answer easier to pronounce. Stubbornness likes to live until morning. The smokehouse door opened on hickory breath and heat held low. Hooks flicking back lamplight in brief answers. The butcher's block a blunt altar with 2 smooth grooves carved by years of hunger and habit. Rooms confess without language. Sir, Fenwick said, keeping his voice down because sound does odd things in cedar country. Lime heap at the corner. Lime makes promises it can't keep. Corbett knelt and ran 2 fingers through the white mound and smelled that clean lie it tells. No blood here, no flies, no story you can sell a chaplain. Chemistry is half liturgy and half theft. He stood and bounced his boot heel once, and heard the note change, where tamped clay turned shallow underfoot, the kind of hollowness a farmer hears when the earth has been asked politely to forget. Ground is the best witness in any county. From Corbett's deposition, I thrust with the bayonet to a depth of 6 inches and struck something that sounded like billiards when a cue goes wrong. I said only a shovel. Sound can swear. Ezekiel handed over a shovel with a grip too polished for garden work, the wood shining where a palm had lived too often, and Fenwick took it and bit the earth in careful squares the way a man taught not to be a goal still knows he is being made one. Technique survives disgust. First scrape lime and clay, second scrape darker earth that drank and did not leak. Third scrape a curve pale as winter moon at the rim of a furrow where no moon should be. Bone, Fenwick said, and he was a man who had seen bones arranged by surgeons and scattered by shot, and still he had to use the word to keep his throat open. Naming is a door you must walk through. Ruth set her lamp on the threshold, and in that light the white grew whiter, the round turning into the flat of a joint, the joint becoming the head of a femur, where it meets a human hip. Recognition poisons denial. From P.V. Amos Fenwick's statement, appended in 1867, I lifted the piece loose and 2 teeth rolled with it like dice. I am a farm boy. I know hog from man by the shape of a molar. Familiarity draws the line. Ezekiel said, hogs, because a man in a corner will move his mouth, even when it has nothing left to sell, and Ruth said nothing at all, because she had learned the price of words. Silence can be the worst confession. Corbett put his palm flat on the dirt at the pit's lip, felt the cold that lingers under lime, and took a breath he put nowhere later when he told the story. Some air doesn't belong to the lungs. Inside, he said to one of the men without turning his head, look to the walls for anything that knocks hollow. And the private stepped back into the dog trot where the cold made his breath a statement. Orders want neighbors. PVT. Battle, so named by accident or destiny, tapped the interior plank half with his knuckles and listened for the difference between solid and story. Wood testifies when asked the right way. Third plank to the left of the hearth gave a note like a small drum, and he set the tip of his bayonet to it and pried until the nail surrendered and the plank came up, and the wind from the hollow slid in, as if tasting the room for the first time. Openings have appetite. Behind the plank lay a pocket of paper, wearing the smell of oil and lampblack. Slips in a neat stack with Jefferson Davis's face attempted in a hand that had learned confidence too fast. The serial on the top 2 bills matched exactly. Numbers should never echo in that place. From Provost Marshall's field note March 9, 1863, found Confederate notes of forged, repeated serials, ink homemade, sees plate Zick, misproportioned bust. Crime forgets to vary its habits. Back in the smokehouse, Fenwick dug a second spade, width, and found the curve of a rib, then the smooth of a skull fragment whose sutures looked for a brief, brutal moment like trails on a map. Geography cannot help here. By God, Battle said from the doorway because profanity sometimes serves as a pronoun. Vocabulary shrank. Ezekiel moved then, a big man who had waited for his moment. Shoulder first into Corbett's back like a battering ram, the shove honest in its violence, the arc of his elbow catching the sergeant at the ear. Force has simple grammar. Corbett went to a knee with a grunt and brought his Colt up, because training lives in the bones, the pistol's muzzle rising to find a chest through lamplight and smoke, and then stopping because the room contained too much tinder and too many lies that would like to be set on fire. Restraint is harder than aim. Don't, he said without shouting, and the word found Ruth before it found Ezekiel, the syllable pulling at whatever string was tied to her hands. Some commands bypass muscle and go straight to weather. She stepped between them in a way that had worked 100 times, when men raised their voices over supper or whiskey. And it worked now, not because Corbett lowered the gun, but because Ezekiel read it and stood with his breath anchoring his ribs to his shirt. A pause can be a verdict. From neighbor Martha Lamb's recollection, taken 1866, I heard no shots. I heard a spade and a man say a name like he was praying it would change. Witnesses find the only detail they can live with. Rope, Corbett said, and Battle fetched the length from the kitchen bench. The loop slick where hands had paid attention, and they bound Ezekiel easy and tight, not for show but for patience. Restraint is a kind of punctuation. Ruth did not ask to be bound and was not. She sat at the table and set both her hands, palms down, on either side of the upside down cup and looked at the wood, as if it could be made to grow. Surrender can look like prayer when there is no point in any other posture. They dug until 4 spade widths made a square, and the square became a wound that did not clot, until the air turned damp with the insistence of the ground's memory, until teeth and buttons and the smooth of a shoulder blade spoke at a volume civility cannot drown. Evidence changes tone. From Corbett's deposition, I pulled an eagle button out of lime and wiped it on my sleeve, and the mark came back. And I thought of a boy in Hamilton who wrote to his mother that buttons were the only things that could be counted, when a man could not. I put it in my pocket without looking at him. Sentiment keeps a ledger too. Inside, Battle laid the seized bills side by side under the lamplight and frowned, because the same flourish appeared in the same angle twice, and he said, "They pass these in dim rooms, not as an accusation but as a carpenter assesses a joint. Competence speaks without heat." Ezekiel tried once more, because a man will say what worked yesterday, even when today has been arranged against it. Hogs. And this time it sounded like an apology to a profession. Excuses wear out. PVT. Fenwick sank his shovel one last time and lifted a femur complete, soil clinging to it like a final skin, the round head bright and obscene in good lamp, and he held it a moment, because sometimes a hand has to convince a mind. Weight settles the argument. He laid the bone down across the block, because there was nowhere else to put it, and because the grooves there had been teaching this town a lie, and needed a correction. Fittings find their true purpose at last. Ruth closed her eyes then, not to shut out what was present, but to see something that was not, which is the hardest thing we ask of the guilty and the innocent both. Memory chooses its own mercy. From a note added in the margin of the provost report, and later crossed out, recommend arrest, recommend charges, recommend careful handling owing to local feeling. Paper anticipates a fire and still believes in procedure. Outside, the cedar held their breath with them, and the fox that lives near the west fence decided not to bark, because there are nights when even animals refuse commentary. Nature can be kind to men if men are not kind to each other. Corbett straightened, wiped lime from his hand with a square of cloth he did not want back, and looked at Ezekiel as a man looks at a cipher that has finally shown a number. Understanding fixes a face. "You bury your share," he said, repeating the line because it deserved to be tried against the new light, and then some. Echoes lose their manners. No one reached for the cup on the table. No one reached for the Bible. They did reach for the paper in Corbett's pocket, because the same order that opens doors can close them. And then document why, and he unfolded it, and began to write on the back with a carpenter's stub, words that would carry less noise than the shovel had and more weight. Writing is the quietest kind of arrest. From P.V. Fenwick's statement, "I did not swear. I did not cry. I said, 'Sir,' and the sergeant said, 'Yes.' Then we stood there a minute more, because moving felt like lying. Stillness became a sentence. They had come for rumor and left with a fact that stained anything it touched. The air, the rope, the pocket where the button slept without permission, the planks that had hidden paper with a government's face turned wrong. Reality had insisted on being counted, and when they finally stepped out into the dog trot to call for a wagon, the night took the sound and set it down somewhere. The pike could pick it up and carry it to headquarters, to a ledger, to a name that would not show in the next census. Shock writes fast. The block in the smokehouse had been cut for hogs and baptized in men. The pit under it said so without a sermon. By the end of that week in March 1863, word of bones under the smokehouse had moved faster than a dispatch, carried by picket talk and hospital rumor, and the way a man's face changes when he returns from a place he wishes he had not seen. Fear traveled without needing a horse. Provost orders followed the whisper with the weight of ink. A printed circular tacked in mess tents and read aloud at roll call. Its sentences stiff with caution. Procedure tried to outrun appetite. Circular, Department of the Cumberland, 12th of March 1863. No soldier will lodge alone at farmsteads within 5 miles of the Nashville Pike. Food and drink from unknown households are not to be taken. Detached men will move in pairs. All burials will be witnessed by the nearest officer or chaplain. Rules learned new verbs. Sutlers did brisk business in brass-named discs. The private ID tags soldiers had begun to buy on their own, and by April the camps around Murfree. From the Diary of P. Veet, J.T. Loomis, 15th Indiana, 21 March 1863. Bought a disc with my name in case someone needs to find me when I am not available to speak. The man said I would not be sorry. I wished to be neither found nor lost. Insurance felt like surrender. In town, quartermasters tightened their fists around greenbacks and let graybacks slide off palm and counter with the disgust of men tired of guessing. Currency took sides. Treasury agents, not yet named Secret Service but practicing its posture, rode rail and road with bulging saddlebags, spreading test lessons to shopkeepers, check the cereals, look close at the flourish, hold paper to a lamp to judge its thirst. Detection became a parlor trick taught as defense. From a Treasury memorandum rotted to Nashville, April 1863, counterfeit CS, notes observed with repeated serials and crude bust. Advise merchants refuse dim, room transactions, trust silver over paper where possible. Advice wore distrust like a cloak. Back in Widow's Hollow, the Lowry place stood under guard for a week, while provost scribes inventoried hooks and cleaver, lime and chain, the forge, plate impressions, the money nest behind plank. Evidence made a ledger out of a room. Count taken 15th of March 1863. Hooks iron 23, blocked grain, grooves 2 of chain I1 length iron, pitted, cleavery 8-inch, back notched bone saw 1 in lime lye barrel clotted, plate sear zinc 2, forge notes C assorted 47. Numbers speak without tremor. The army adapted outward from that address the way a drop turns to rings. Pickets posted closer together. Foragers ordered to shout their challenge before entering a dog trot. Chaplains told to keep a hand on the shovel when words ran out. Doctrine learned to lean on touch. From Chaplain E.T. Ward's field note, April 1863. I do not often put my hand to earth in uniform. I do now, to feel what is beneath. And I say a prayer in a quieter voice lest I wake something that should not be invited to speak. Faith learned new acoustics. Locals adapted too, out of caution or calculation or both. Some households propped doors open and served coffee on thresholds only. Some women wore a small knife pinned into their shawls like a brooch. Some men added one narrow board to their smokehouse pit and called it insurance. Survival taught carpentry. The nickname grew. Butchers of Widow's Hollow, first as a bark of anger, then as a flat term spoken by men who no longer wanted to decorate the thing. Names can be hammers. In camp, young soldiers who had not seen the block asked old soldiers who had, and the old soldiers answered in the measured way of men who know their words might keep someone alive. Instruction wore the shape of a story. From Sjeet L. Corbett's note pinned to a company board. If you must choose between hunger and hospitality, choose hunger and tell the sergeant why. The road back is longer from a pallet than from a fence. Advice carried the weight of a scar. The Lowrys themselves were led away and held in a log guardhouse that smelled of damp straw and ink. Their names entered into a book that never found its way into a courtroom's docket. Justice stumbled when it had to lift its feet. Provost Marshal's draft charge sheet, never filed. Ezekiel Lowry, Ruth Lowry, murders unspecified, forgery CS notes, obstruction secreting remains, impersonation of charity. Law rehearsed without an audience. The war rolled forward regardless. Wheeler's cavalry nipped at wagon trains. Rosecrans drilled and waited and planned the Tullahoma move. Bragg muttered and held a line he would later abandon. And yet Widow's Hollow remained a small gravity that tugged at conversations in mess lines and at wells. One story can tip a whole county's balance. From a civilian letter, Martha Elam to her sister in Shelbyville, May 1863. Do not trust a glow at night that looks like comfort. Do not take a cup until you have seen it poured. Do not stand in a smokehouse doorway long enough to learn its furniture. Domestic counsel hardened. Skeptics called the Army's fear overdrawn and said war makes men see knives in spoons. And then a patrol near Eagleville found bones under a different smokehouse, and the argument thinned. Repetition teaches conviction. March to June saw other adjustments. Soldiers lashed bells to the butt of their rifles at night to wake one another if a hand moved where it should not. Some tied a string around a wrist and to a bunkmate's belt. Loop. All learned to sleep with their boots under their heads. Trust became a rope. The forged notes found behind the Lowrys plank taught a different lesson that spread faster than any tract. Paper lies easily when pressed hard enough, and merchants began to slice tens in half and pay only when a cereal could be matched to a store's book. Money wore a leash. By late spring, a Nashville printer who had never met the Lowrys wrote a broadside titled, "Beware the false face of paper," and sold it for a penny, and soldiers pasted it inside the lids of field desks and sutlers pinned it near their scales. Prophecy found prophet. In June, the Army's Tullahoma campaign moved, nimble and rain-soaked, and the Lowry story traveled with the columns in the back pocket of prayer, "Do not be taken in, do not be taken." Wisdom shortened its sentences. From PVT, Imos Fenwick's letter home, 2 July 1863, "We march in water to the ankles and sometimes to the knees. The men still speak of Widow's Hollow when we pass a house that is too tidy for the amount of hunger in the county. I cannot tell if I have grown meaner or wiser. Growth hurt. The Lowry homestead did not endure the competition of rumor and law. It met a different arithmetic in late summer, when neighbors who had once bought candles from Ruth and watched Ezekiel have a hog decided the Bible on the table did not balance the bone in the pit. Affidavit, unsigned, filed with county clerk after the fact. We burned it ourselves because courts would take too long and men would come and say words until the ground forgot to speak. Violence wore a crown and called itself local. They came at dusk with resinous pine and flint, with a kerosene can that looked like a small church, bell and burned faster than anyone judged fair, with mouths tight against chants that might sound like celebration if a stranger listened. Fury tries to dress itself as duty and forgets its buttons. Witness recollection, MLM, I said not to, and then I said to, and then I stood and watched, because there was nothing else left for a woman to do. The smoke went straight up as if it had an appointment. Conscience changed sides twice and called it balance. The smokehouse roof sagged, and then shrugged itself into collapse, sending a flurry of red like a prayer that had been folded too many times, and now refused to lay flat. Closure makes a poor bonfire and a good excuse. In the walls of the main room, men with hooks pulled plank after plank until the money nest spilled like crows lifting all at once. Notes fluttering, cereals repeating, the zinc plates ringing dully when they hit the floor. Lies made noise when they were finally freed. From a Treasury agent's report, September 1863, recovered in fire's aftermath, fragments of forged notes, plate remnants, ink well fused. Recommend watch on merchants in Murfreesboro for past 5s and 10s. Serial 38242 repeats. Smoke left clues. No trial followed. Only the long, unsatisfactory hush that communities adopt when their anger has outrun their appetite for detail. Silence can feel like completion if everyone agrees to refrain from nouns. And yet the adaptations persisted, because a lesson hard learned refuses to soften even when its object is ash. Habit ossified. Commanders leaned into caution. Detachments logged time on doorsteps. Chaplains tallied burials with the precision of a quartermaster. Surgeons wrote extra lines in company books to note the disposition of men gone to civilian care. Paper behaved as if it could build fences. From the minutes of a brigade staff meeting, November 1863, resolved, all men on detached duty to check in at picket line on return and make account of lodgings taken. Accountability grew a spine. The wider war taught its own adaptations around paper and bodies. The National Banking Act of 1863 began to press for uniformity. The Legal Tender Acts had already taught a populace to tolerate green. Counterfeit swelled regardless. promising the logic that would birth the Secret Service in 65. Reform watched the rear. By 1864, soldiers in other departments had their own names for places like Widow's Hollow. Arkansas kept hers, Virginia hers, and sermons in field chapels sometimes included the stray admonition to avoid the comfort you have not paid for. Piety absorbed a precaution from a Nashville paper's wartime brief, clipped and saved in a surgeon's book. Beware lone hospitable houses on marches. Reports from several counties of robbers and worse using the forms of kindness to trap the unwary. Journalism became folk wisdom with vowels. When the war ended and federal authority grew a spine again, the Department of the Cumberland sent files to Nashville and Washington, some stamped medical, some currency, some bearing no mark because a clerk did not know which desk would take a thing with neither patient nor plaintiff. Bureaucracy sorted sins. A few survivors of the Lowry kindness testified in 1866 at tables that smelled of oil and old paper. They did not want to and did anyway, and they used the smallest words they could find that would not break their mouths. Memory chose arithmetic. From S.G. L. Corbet's 1866 deposition. I do not believe in ghosts, but I have put my hand on a block in the dark since then and felt the groove where a blade made water in wood. And I have said out loud, not hogged to make sure the room heard me. Skepticism learned a liturgy. By 1870, the census takers in Rutherford County drew their ink lines down pages and found no Lowry in that hollow. Only cedars and limestone and a ruin that locals avoided even when the shortest path home crossed it by a quarter-mile. Erasure wore boots. The phrase butchers of Widow's Hollow persisted in a quieter way, spoken like a weather report when a man pointed to a glow on a cold night and kept walking. Caution became a compass, and the adaptations outlived their need. Veterans who had learned to turn cups upside down when offered in strange kitchens did so in peacetime without noticing. Men kept their brass-named discs in drawers where wives found them and wondered whether to be grateful. Habit made a shrine of an object by accident. From a woman's letter to her sister, 1868, Eli still taps the plank before he sits and smells the coffee before he drinks and puts a coin on the saucer when he has finished as if to pay for his life. I do not scold him. I let him buy his breath. Love made room for ritual. The forge plates rusted, the block weathered, the hooks pitted and fell, but the doctrine written by fear and ink and ash remained in the country's hands. Sleep in pairs, watch what you are given, mark your dead. Mistrust a kindness that asks for nothing. Adaptation became inheritance. And in the hollow itself, the cedars thickened where the smoke had blackened them, and the limestone drank rain as it had always done, and fox and bird returned to their own accounting, uninterested in paper, untroubled by names. The land recovered faster than the people. By the time the story reached men who had not fought in that winter, it had worn smooth enough to be told in 3 sentences. There was a house, it fed men, it buried them. Compression sharpened the edge. Yet beneath the brevity, the county kept the long version in its bones. The circulars, the discs, the rules, the fire, the silence. And every time a veteran hesitated at a threshold a second longer than courtesy demanded, it spoke. Fear had become a discipline with a memory of its own. For 3 winter weeks around Stone's River, Widow's Hollow set the terms of passage for the desperate and the tired, its lamp deciding which uniform slept and which did not wake. Authority wore an apron. Movement made the Lowry place powerful, blue columns breaking into strings in the cedar, gray riders slipping off the pike to water mounts, foragers drifting house to house in 2s and 3s. Chaos made customers. From December 3, 1862, through January 2, 1863, the county absorbed 24,000 casualties. Hospitals overflowed into churches and parlors, and men with bandaged throats followed the first warm light they found. Pain learns its mettle by color. In that overflow, 1 dog trot and 1 smokehouse could shape a corridor of the living with nothing more than broth, a bolt, and a block rubbed smooth by habit. Small machines rule when big ones stall. By mid-January, the pattern read like a drill. Men left the road at dusk, swallowed steam from a tin cup, and were buried before daylight. Others turned away by instinct or luck, found their feet again in the ruts and walked on. Repetition does the killing with a polite voice. Numbers piled even when no clerk wrote them straight. 3 to 5 stragglers a night during the battle's wake. 2 rooms always warm, 1 smokehouse door that never creaked, lime by the third of a barrel, replenished weekly, hooks 23, always enough, arithmetic became appetite. From Pvt. A.D. 21st Ohio, recollection dated 1867, they didn't need many of us. They only needed enough to make not asking seem like kindness to the rest. Mercy turned transactional. Counterfeit joined flesh in the ledger, a secondary harvest moving along mule paths and dim counters, 10s and 5s with cereals that mirrored themselves like faces pressed against pain. Paper learned predation. Refused 3 notes at dusk, same hand in the 2s. A shopkeeper scrawled on a scrap pinned under his scale, the ink blotted at the corner where a thumb had pressed too hard. Commerce felt teeth. In camp, a phrase took hold the way weather does. Smokehouse dread. Passed from fire to fire with the steadiness of a catechism. Fear adopted a uniform. Orders hardened in a hurry. No solitary lodgings, no accepting cups unpoured before you, no burial without a witness, no notes passed in low light without a match held to the face. Policy copied panic. From Brigade Order 13th U.S. January 1863. Men on detached duty will bivouac at picket lines if lodging not secured by officer. Be not enticed from the road. Report households of unusual hospitality. Command learn to write suspicion. The Lowrys' reach was not measured in miles, but in choices they erased. Men who would have shared a table chose a fence line. Soldiers who might have asked for bread walked on. Chaplains who had words set their hands to soil, because words had failed elsewhere. Power rearranged habits. Reports made their own drumbeat. Provost patrols doubled on the Nashville Pike. 5 farmsteads inspected closely. 3 cleared, 1 warned, 1 marked for return. 12 forged notes seized in Murfreesboro with the same flourish in the serial. 4 ID discs sold for every 1 purchased the week before. Paper sprinted to keep up. From sheet, L. Crabet's penciled notice to his company. Turn the cup over first. If they flinch at that, leave. Instructions shed courtesy. Within the hollow, domination looked like routine. Ruth's steady hand on the rim of a tin, Ezekiel's shoulder in a doorway, a lock that slid without complaint. Theater earned obedience. The human cost ran in 2 ledgers at once, bone and belief. A pit that drank evidence and a county that learned to mistrust the touch that warmed it. Damage does not choose between body and mind. After the discovery, fear widened rather than broke. Men who had never stepped into that yard still hesitated at other doors. Names of the missing multiplied into the space rumor keeps ready, and currency itself began to carry a smell no wash could lift. Contagion of caution became the weather. From Chaplain E. T. Ward's Field Journal, January 1863. I have come to bless graves I do not dig, and to forbid beds I do not own. I would prefer sermons. Conscience staggered under new tasks. Even the numbers in the official books learned to mimic cadence. Burials witnessed up. Single, lodgers down. Counterfeit returned up. Complaints filed cautious. Statistics took a side. At their apex, the Lowrys managed to place a hand on every weak seam. Hunger, fatigue, paper, trust. And to press just hard enough to bend men inward. Pressure became policy. Citizens adjusted in the only direction left, toward fire and rope. And when the house finally burned, it did not end the rule so much as spread it, because ashes made the story portable and fear more general. Destruction nationalized a lesson. From a Nashville man's clip note, April 1863. Do not take supper where smoke smells like hickory, and the door seems eager to shut. Advice replaced geography. The Army of the Cumberland moved on to Tullahoma and beyond, but the Hollow's vocabulary stuck. Men tapped plank before sitting, sniffed coffee before sipping, counted hooks when they could not help looking. Ritual is what power leaves behind when it's gone, and in that season, when a small address could tilt the choices of 2 armies and a dozen parishes. Widow's Hollow did not need a map to prove its dominion. The county walked by it and walked by its rules. After Stone's River, the Union's answer to the cedar thickets was not a sermon, but a supply line, iron rails and timbered depots pushing south from Nashville, until even hollows had to learn a new calendar. Logistics arrived like weather. Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Meigs fed the Army of the Cumberland from a city-turned-warehouse, sending rations, cartridges, blankets, and nails along the Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad under U.S. military railroads control. Authority learned to travel by timetable. By February 1863, work gangs and pioneer brigades hammered pilings into the Stones River's banks and raised Fortress Rosecrans, 4 miles of earthworks and timber. The largest enclosed fort the Union would build for war. Mass replaced charm. Call. James St. Clair Morton's engineers measured the redoubts with a surveyor's calm, the post and crib construction stacking muscle into the soil until Murfreesboro could store months of food and ammunition behind angles of earth. Geometry out, argued rumor. From an engineer's field note, February 1863, fort to encompass depots and railhead, capacity to hold provisions for an army. Work continuous. Digging outpaced doubt. Railcars groaned into the depot with flour, hardtack, coffee, salt pork, beans, sugar, candles, and cartridges, the lids of barrels stenciled in black letters that looked like laws, labels disciplined appetite. Bread and bullets traveled together in tall columns, sacks of flour stacked to rafters, crates of 58 caliber mini cartridges by the thousand, bacon sides salted to stone, coffee by the hundredweight, blankets by the bale. Quantity kept men moving. From a commissary tally, March 1863, daily issue. Hard bread 20,000 rat of rations, pork bacon to match, coffee sugar at regulation levels. Numbers made promises and kept them. Telegraph wire walked the pike on poles like a second fence, carrying Rosecrans's orders and Nashville's answers. The dots and dashes faster than any courier, faster than fear, faster than Widow's Hollow's lamp could blink. Distance folded. Provost Marshal detachments multiplied under this canopy of iron and wood, their ledgers growing square and stiff, their signatures tightening over the months until the script itself looked like discipline. Paper learned posture. That discipline spread inwards from the railhead as an operating system. Passes issued in standardized forms, burial witness lines inked in duplicates, received and issued. Columns snapped straight, counterfeit advisories pinned to store counters like catechism. Bureaucracy became armor. From a Treasury circular posted in Nashville, spring 1863, beware notes with repeated serials, decline dim room transactions, prefer coin, national currency forthcoming. Policy spoke with measured breath. Ohio and Indiana factories that had once turned plows began to turn wagon hardware and harness buckles. Pittsburgh rolled iron. St. Louis and Cincinnati printed forms, while their presses waited for the new national bank notes that the Legal Tender Acts and National Currency Act promised. Industry learned new hymns. The avalanche reached Widow's Hollow in indirect ways that still bruised. Provost patrols scheduled on a clock instead of a rumor. Foraging parties coached to approach doorways like sieges. Chaplains issued pre-printed burial certificates alongside their Bibles. Routine sought to occupy hearts. From Chaplain E.T. Ward's note, April 1863, I carry a shovel, a form, and a prayer. The shovel has the fewest arguments. Piety bent to procedure. Meanwhile, the Confederate currency the Lowrys pressed in the dark began to fail in the sun. Graybacks inflated and smeared. Signatures varied. Paper coarsened as blockade months lengthened, and merchants turned away notes that once would have bought a winter. Ink cannot fight arithmetic. Counterfeits found fewer dim counters to land upon as Treasury agents taught a town to squint. Cereals compared, flourishes matched, paper held to lamp, the habit passing from shop to sutler to soldier to widow. Detection scaled like a trade. On the Union side, paymasters handed over greenbacks that held together, a promise the war tested daily, and men learned to trust the feel even when they mistrusted the future. Stability has a texture. At Fortress Rosecrans, the new machine's rhythm became the county's climate. Trains in, wagons out, forage in, waste out, day after day. An echo of wheels on planks and rails that made the Hollow's small mechanics sound like an old story. Soundtracks change loyalties. From a pioneer's diary, we'll throw up earth, ankle, deep, then knee the fort will hold what mouths and muskets require. The rail brings more than rumor. Sweat affirmed strategy. Medical supply lines thickened too. Ambulance wagons with leaf springs hissed along new, made corduroy, hospital tents doubled. Laudanum and chloroform flowed with a steadiness that made mercy possible and suspicion manageable. Chemistry obeyed more honest orders. Embalming, still rare in the West but growing, sent traveling surgeons with arsenical fluids and handbills, and even that trade began to carry receipts and forms that made bereavement legible to offices in Nashville and beyond. Death grew paperwork. The avalanche did not feel heroic, it felt inexorable. Iron, timber, paper, inventory, schedules, the sort of pressure that made small corners less dangerous, because everything around them was already spoken for by a bigger machine. Momentum tamed shadows. From a staff memorandum at Murfreesboro Depot, rations for 40 Zilozan on hand, ordnance stores sufficient, transportation adequate. Patrols increased on all roads north and west. Capacity became comfort. Fear learned to look over its shoulder at something useful. Engineers pacing out readouts. Telegraphers tapping, teamsters cursing mired wheels out of ruts with the rhythm of men who know they will try again after dark. Purpose dulled panic. The Lowry evidence, under guard and then under glass in a provost office, became a museum of warning. Cleaver tagged, plate bagged, forged notes pinned, a femur wrapped in cloth and labeled as if it were another barrel in the depot. Exhibit A taught faster than any sermon. From a provost captain's briefing, remember, gentle voices, hard habits, knock with the musket, not the knuckles, witness the hole you fill. The method codified the memory. The Secret Service did not yet exist. Its birth waited for 1865. But the habit that would feed it already walked the pike in the pockets of men who held up paper to lamps and read the grain like palmists. Vigilance rehearsed its first day, rail length by rail length. The Union put Middle Tennessee on a schedule, Nashville to Murfreesboro running daily until timbers warped from repetition, and wheels learned every inch of plank on every bridge by rote. Infrastructure learned the county by heart. From Rosecrans's headquarters orders, February 1863, Reuben Rail, secure depots, complete works. Short sentences but long walls. The avalanche pressed further south as the Tullahoma campaign unfolded in June, bridges repaired behind withdrawing Confederates, depots sprouting in new towns, telegraph poles advancing like a pressed line of trees planting themselves overnight. Advance made permanence. By then, the widow's hollow farmstead was black and flat, a cautionary scar that supply wagons passed without slowing, drivers glancing once as men do when they do not want to test whether a story can still see them. Ruin had been folded into the rote. In Murfreesboro, soldiers bought brass ID discs from sutlers who had them by the tray, stamped names into them with little hammers, and strung them with cord. Tins of coffee and tobacco changed hands in a square that smelled like mule and yeast and iron. Identity and comfort wore the same polish. The quartermaster's avalanche found its way into the way men slept. 2 by 2, back-to-back boots on, canteens filled, sergeants marked down times and places, chaplains marked down names and final words where they could, provosts marked down houses, doors, and the direction of their hinges. Detail fenced chaos. From a brigade sergeant, major's daily return, detachments returned 14, lodgings private 0, burials witnessed 3 recorded. The math steadied a heartbeat. Widow's Hollow never had a chance against a nation that had made paper a weapon and iron a prayer, that could throw a fort up in a month and a rail back down in a week, that could grind its own lessons into circulars and put them on every board. Scale defeated secrecy. The bones under the smokehouse had once been the center of a small, terrible gravity. Now they were an entry in a report that traveled at the speed of wire. From a telegraph sent Nashville, Murfreesboro, March 1863. Casasiope evorete securidistope uadodthdra dodustopiroshidsor deride wires closed circles. Where fear had ruled a crossroads for 3 nights, logistics ruled a county for 3 years, forging habits that would outlast the uniforms. Count your men, mark your dead, double your patrols, check your notes, build your depot before you build your story. Systems drilled themselves into bone, and in that relentless pile of rails and timbers and ledgers and orders, the hollow's power thinned the way fog thins at noon. Still present in memory, still cool at the ankle, but retreating from the road as the sun forced the timetable forward. Iron kept time when shadows tried to. After the Tullahoma rains and the great, ragged arc of campaigns that followed, the hollow folded back into cedar and limestone, the dog trot a black scar in memory, and the smokehouse a shape the county refused to redraw. Silence reclaimed the bend in the road. Veterans carried it farther than maps did. Stories travel better than markers. At reunions where coffee boiled in iron kettles and brass-name discs clinked in pockets like coins saved from a bad year, men found themselves tapping table planks before they sat without knowing why. Habit wears a groove even after the source is ash. From Sgt. L. Corbett's deposition, 1866. I do not believe in ghosts, but I have put my hand on a block in the dark since then and felt the groove where a blade made water in wood. And I have said out loud, not hog, to make sure the room heard me. Fear learned a liturgy. The Army's paperwork, scattered to archives and trunks and fires, and in one bundle the provost's sealed appendix, medical confidentiality, lay like a stone on a riverbed, changing the current without showing its face. Bureaucracy kept shame in tidy envelopes. A clerk's phrase, quietly suppressed, slipped into 2 ledgers and then into talk, where it described a mood more than a policy. Words sometimes outlive facts. The Lowry name did not outlive the census man's ink in that hollow, 1870s neat hand stepping past the bend with the cruelty of restraint. Erasure is an action performed politely. Neighbors told themselves contradictory kindness for decades. We never knew, and we always suspected, and the story settled where both could live, in the space between smoke and fog on cold mornings when breath hangs low over cedars. Memory is a talented liar. From Martha Elam's recollection, we said not to, and then we said to, and the smoke went straight up as if it had an appointment. Judgment rarely arrives undecorated. The forged notes, when they surface in talk, are described as too stiff, too black, too eager at the flourish, a detail men learned from Treasury circulars posted in shop windows and carried home in the same mind that held birth dates and winter stores. Education wed itself to suspicion. In June 1865, the United States Secret Service was created to hunt counterfeiters. Its first agents walking with the same posture the provosts had learned on the Nashville Pike, comparing cereals by lamplight and teaching merchants to squint. Paper became a battlefield with uniforms of ink. What the Lowrys did with plates and lampblack cannot claim invention, only nerve sharpened by famine and the fog of war. Opportunity prefers compromised conditions. The war's other machine, national currency, standardized design, disciplined paper, quieted the dim, room trade that once would have welcomed a passable 10. System beat improvisation, from a Treasury advisory saved behind a shop counter in Murfreesboro. Beware notes with repeated serials, decline dim, room transactions, prefer coin. Commerce kept its catechism. In Rutherford County, the wound-named Stones River grew a park and a fence and a way to be told. Cedar glades preserved, limestone outcrops labeled, troop movements mapped with arrows that can be walked now, without hearing the crack that made them matter. History learned the stagecraft of healing. Guides do not point to Widow's Hollow on their regular route, and the best of them will say gently when asked that some places leave more behind if left unmarked. Absence can be a kind of mercy. Still, a few names persist in local files like seeds that refuse to rot. Corbett, Elam, Ward, and they grow when the right questions fall. Provenance is stubborn. From Chaplain E.T. Ward's journal, 1863-64, copied by a granddaughter, I carry a shovel, a form, and a prayer. The shovel has the fewest arguments. Faith admitted the weight. Veterans brought home a survival choreography that their wives watched and tolerated. Cups turned upside down for a heartbeat before being sipped. Planks tapped with a knuckle near the hearth. Doors left on the latch only when voices filled the room. Ritual persisted after need. A woman wrote in 1868, Eli still taps the plank before he sits and smells the coffee before he drinks and puts a coin on the saucer when he has finished as if to pay for his life. I do not scold him, I let him buy his breath. Love made room for superstition. The smokehouse in memory keeps its own inventory. Hooks 23, block with 2 grooves, chain 1 length, lime 1/3 of a barrel, Because numbers are a way to contain nausea. Arithmetic tames horror. The war taught millions to mistrust paper, and to trust the men who could move barrels, raise forts, and spin wire. The hollow taught a county to mistrust its hunger, and to trust the pause between offer and acceptance. A single kitchen table can educate more sternly than a fort. From a pioneer's diary, winter 1863. We throw up earth, ankle deep, then knee. The fort will hold what mouths and muskets require. The rail brings more than rumor. Iron replaced rumor with routine. He did not know he was writing the epitaph of a countryside's fear. The moment logistics made small crimes smaller by sheer noise. Scale is its own anesthesia. Those who argue that justice failed the Lowrys choose a narrow definition of justice, and those who argue that the fire purified the hollow choose a narrow definition of purification. Both choose to ignore the wind. God's justice, men said as they struck flint to resinous pine, and watched the roof bow and the rafters lean. Theology often arrives with kerosene. They burned the ledger the historian wanted, and saved the phrase the poet needed. And this is how communities work, when they are busy surviving rather than instructing the future. Loss can be curated by omission. From a soldier's later recollection scribbled on a reunion program, 1887, "It is a hard thing, the country teaches you, to accept a kindness and to survive it. I keep my disc in a drawer to remember which I chose. Objects inherit decision. If there were artifacts, cleaver tagged with a number, plate pinned under glass. They moved through hands and rooms and floods and auctions until their labels lost their glue and their stories lost their handles. Things drift without witnesses. The bones under the smokehouse, exhumed and catalogued in a pencil that smudged at corners, were reinterred without trumpets a mile away, near a fence line that rattled in January wind and a patch of wild onion that knew nothing of men. Nature keeps a different book." From the reinterment note unsigned 1865, remains gathered, placed lime removed where possible, earth tamped. Prayer said. Minimal sentences carry maximum weight. Children grew up in that county learning two contradictory lessons at once. Be generous at your door and be careful at your door. And both felt like patriotism when told by the right mouth. Paradox enlisted. The narrow industry at the Lowry place, hickory smoke and lampblack, hooks and lime, meets the broad industry of the war, rails, forts, payrolls, at a crossroads that still stands even if the road has a new name. Mechanisms recognize kin. The counterfeiter's work disappears under the very agency created to catch them. The murderer's names vanish in tidy census lines, and what remains is the deed and the caution. Do not be enticed from the road, copied onto 1,000 tongues without attribution. Folk wisdom is efficient. From a brigade order posted and kept by a farmer, 1863, be not enticed from the road. Some imperatives never retire. There is a temptation to bend the story, to make the Lowrys into what the war needed to understand itself. Monsters that explain what happens when law sleeps, or victims of scarcity, pressed into sin by necessity. Temptations tidy the floor, where facts still bleed. The plainer version is uglier and more useful. A man and a woman learn to speak comfort while arranging harm, and a county learn not to confuse the one with the other. Moral clarity can be a poor companion, but a fine teacher. The cedar glades along Stone's River hold their own cool in summer, and if you step off the paved path to where limestone noses up through thin soil, you can hear, if you want to, the discipline that fear taught. In the careful steps of descendants, in the paused breath of readers, in the way a hand still hovers over a cup when the light is poor. Echoes become custom. From the margins of a chaplain's last letter, before he left the army, "I would prefer sermons again." Weariness finally asked permission, and in the kind of small museum room where glass cases are the size of trunks and labels the size of visiting cards, there might be a cleaver with a pitted spine, or a zinc plate with Jefferson Davis's jawline a hair off, or only a blank space titled with a phrase everyone knows and no one will own. Sometimes absence is the truest exhibit. The war pushed the country toward uniform paper, uniform procedure, uniform graves, but it left pockets where kindness had to be tested and trust had to be audited with a knuckle on plank and a match under a note. Vigilance became a domestic art. Widow's Hollow cannot be found by signpost, but it can be reached by an angle in the mind, a caution that survives rations and parades, and the thinning of diaries in family trunks. Fear made a map and folded it small. Cheat. Corbett's button, the eagle rubbed back to life on a sleeve and pocketed without permission, slept in a drawer for years, and then was placed in a child's palm, like a coin with the warning attached. Count yourself when the room asks nothing of you. Relics choose their sermons. The smokehouse is gone, the dog trot a memory warmed by storyteller's breath. The foxes return to their own arithmetic beyond the fence, and still the rule holds its own kind of dominion in kitchens and crossroads, where soldiers once knocked. Some lessons live longer than houses, because in that cedar seam, between a fort's shadow and a railroad's whistle, the county learned that a lamp can invite and consume at the same time, and it gave the place a name that doesn't need a map to be found. The butchers of Widow's Hollow,